Alright guys, so today we're going to start on our actual civilizations that we'll learn about. So the four that we're going to be talking about over the next week or so are going to be Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley, China, and Egypt. So two of these should look pretty familiar to you because they are the civilizations that your map quizzes are on, which your map quiz is tomorrow, as is your vocab quiz if you had forgotten. So the first one we're going to be looking at is Mesopotamia. So let's start on that. Okay. So Mesopotamia is in the area where Syria is today. So like between Africa and where Asia meets, that area where there's a lot of political turmoil today, like Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, that area is where Mesopotamia was. So in that area, obviously, you know, there's some desert, there is some sort of almost like a prairie land, and the thing that you need to remember about Mesopotamia is that it developed in an area known as the Fertile Crescent. And if you see where my mouse is right here, this highlighted area where it's a little bit lighter, that's what's known as the Fertile Crescent. So it stretches from about the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf in the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. In that area, it's really rich soil, so a lot of crops grow easily there. And you have to think about why people chose to settle here. You know, you're walking in Syria and it's all desert. Or you're walking in Iran and it's all desert. And all of a sudden you come to this sort of oasis spot where there's grass, there's trees, there's water, and you'd almost be crazy to not settle down there because, one, you're protected from other civilizations by the desert, so you're sort of isolated, and two, everything that you need is already there, so you've already got crops growing, you've got your water sources, you've got protection and barrier. So that's why people settled there, is because that Fertile Crescent area just gave them a lot of opportunity to grow and live. Alright, so another thing about the geography of Mesopotamia is that the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, they often flood. So, you know, they had to think about this while they were growing crops. They had to figure out ways to protect themselves from the water, protect their crops from the water, and also use that flooding to their advantage. And we'll talk about ways that they did that. Alright, so Sumer was the world's first civilization. It developed in Mesopotamia about 3300 BC or BCE, whichever you prefer. And Sumer's where we see a lot of the world's firsts. So it's our first civilization, and we talked earlier in the year about how that's where the first writing system came out of, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Alright. Okay, so like I said, rivers frequently flooded Sumer. And we know this, one, because of the way that the dirt layers are, so we've known from excavating that rivers were frequently flooded. And we also know this because of a story called the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this is a narrative written by Herodotus a little bit later in history that tells of great floods that destroys the earth. So in it, Gilgamesh is a king, and he's pretty tyrannical. He's not great to his people. He doesn't know how to rule well. And so his people cry out to the gods to save them, to, you know, remove Gilgamesh from rule. So the gods create a monster to fight Gilgamesh, and they do end up fighting, but at the end of that fight, they become friends. So, through becoming the monster's friend, Gilgamesh, you know, learns a little bit more about what being a ruler should actually be. He learns more about the gods in the world. He wants to go on this quest to gain immortality. And this is probably one of the most important aspects in the Epic of Gilgamesh. He asked the gods to grant him immortality, and they ask him what he's done to deserve it. They say that he hasn't been a good ruler, so why should he be able to walk the world forever? And, Gilgamesh finally realizes that he's not as great as he thinks he is. And, so what he does is he returns home and he realizes that the city he has built, the people who are under his rule, they're his real legacy, and that's how he will be immortal. So he works to make sure he's a better ruler in the future. He, does a lot of public works projects. And that's sort of the Epic of Gilgamesh. An epic is just a super dramatic story, or a super long story. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is, like I said, another one of the world's first. So it's the first written, fiction story. It's the first novel, if you will. Alright, so, because rivers frequently flooded the city, a lot of the villagers had to work together to make sure they controlled those waters. And they controlled it through irrigation and dikes. So irrigation, you know what irrigation is. It's basically just how water is transported from one spot to another. It's how it's taken into cities. And dikes are, like canals or dams, that sort of thing, that kind of control water and keep it from flooding the area around the river. Okay, so Sumerians, their houses were built out of clay and water. So think of adobo, in the western plains region of the United States, that kind of red clay brick. It's the same thing here, and it's shaped into bricks and then dried out in the sun, and then they're kind of stacked and mortared together, just like bricks that we have are. Alright, so how did Sumerians trade? Remember we said that people would want to build on a river, or on a hill near a river because it's a food source, because it's a water source, protection, but mostly because a river is a way to transport. So they used the rivers to trade their items that they had. They also made dangerous journeys across the desert, so they were able to brave the long, hot deserts that surrounded them in order to trade their goods. And archaeologists have actually found goods that were made, in Egypt and India. They found those goods in Sumer, and they found Sumerian goods in Egypt and India. So we know that they traded as far as Egypt and India. And when you think about that feat in 3000 BC, you have to think about, travel wasn't as good as it is today. Travel in that parts, in Iran and Afghanistan, it's still not great. And you just have to think of the bravery and the dedication it took for some people to trade their goods. Okay, so what did their government look like? Sumer was a pretty large city, and it eventually evolved into 12 city-states, which warred for control with each other. So the war leaders became the rulers of the region, and that passage of rule became hereditary, so usually father to son. And their society was set up in a social hierarchy. So we know a hierarchy is a system by which people are ranked according to class or authority. So in Sumer we have a high class, a middle class, and a peasant class. And the high class was basically the ruling families, leading officials that sort of advised that family, and the high priest. So they regarded priests and religious officials as a high class. And that should tell you a little bit more about what their religion was like too, and how well they followed that religion. Alright, the middle class is the lesser priests, the scribes, which we'll talk more about in a second, and the merchant class, and artisans as well. Artisans are skilled craftspeople. Alright, so I have to pause this because I'm up with my 10 minutes. So we'll get there in 1 second.